The hall was full, and every eye in it was on her. Seren had understood, crossing the threshold of Ironhold Court that morning, that she would be looked at. She had prepared herself for it the way she had prepared herself for most things in the 3 months since her pact dissolved, by choosing a posture and holding it. Chin level, hands quiet, breath measured. She could not choose what the assembled wolves of Ironhold saw when they looked at her. She could choose what they saw her do. What they saw was a girl of 19, compact and unremarkable in the undyed wool of a border pack laborer, standing in the center of the tribute hall, while the court arranged itself around her like a wall closing in. The hall was long and stone-floored, its ceiling vaulted high enough that the torches along the walls did not reach the full dark above. Rows of robed figures occupied the tiered gallery at the hall's north end. Advisors, council members, and minor lords arranged themselves according to rank in a way that made the hierarchy visible as architecture. Seren stood where she had been told to stand, in the open center of the floor, with no tier and no seat, and no one beside her. At the head of the hall, on a raised dais of dark-veined stone, a chair sat empty. Not a throne in the decorated sense. A chair built for function, high-backed and plain, that happened to occupy the highest point in the room. The man who would sit in it had not yet entered. She had heard of Lachlan Ironhold the way border wolves heard of weather, as something coming, inevitable, neither cruel nor kind by nature, simply large. Alpha King of the Ironhold Court. Ruler of the Northern Territories from the Greyscar Ridge to the coastal settlements at Helm. The pacts that had not bent to his authority had, over the past decade, quietly ceased to exist. Her own pack, the Thornford border settlement, had bent early and had still dissolved when the debt tithe went unpaid for 3 consecutive seasons. 3 seasons of grain tithe, converted by the council's arithmetic into a service bond owed to the court. The council had assessed the bond. One person would serve it. Seren had no family left to dispute the selection. Elder Croft stood at the near edge of the gallery, a man whose face had arranged itself over many years into an expression of permanent, mild contempt. He held a scroll of pale vellum that he unrolled with the deliberate care of someone who wanted the room to watch him do it. "The border girl," he said, his voice carrying easily in the stone hall. Unranked and unbonded, formerly of the Thornford settlement, now surrendered as tribute against the outstanding debt tithe of that dissolved pack. He said it as though she were an item on a list, which was, she understood, precisely what she was. The hall received this without response, which was its own kind of response. No one objected. No one spoke in her direction. The rows of wolves in their ranked positions simply looked at her, assessed her weight in the court's economy, and found the number small. She had time to register the gallery's collective verdict before the air in the hall shifted. It was not a sound. It was a change in pressure, the way a room changes when a door opens onto winter. The assembled wolves straightened almost imperceptibly, some subtle pack instinct traveling through the gathering before the man himself was visible. Seren kept her chin level. She heard his footsteps, measured and unhurried on the stone, and did not turn until he passed her field of view on his way to the dais. Lachlan Ironhold was taller than she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. He was broad through the shoulder in the way of men who have carried real weight, and he moved without the performance of authority that smaller men sometimes wore. He simply moved, and the room organized itself around where he was. He did not look at her as he passed. He took his seat at the dais, rested his hands on the arms of the chair, and looked at the hall. The proceedings lasted the better part of an hour. Seren stood through all of it. Terms were recited, documents were produced and acknowledged, and the 3 seasons of Thornford's debt were formally received as satisfied in principle and pending in service. She would be assigned to the household staff, duration to be determined by the council. Elder Croft spoke the most, with the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to having his words become fact by virtue of his speaking them. Lachlan said almost nothing. When he spoke, twice, it was brief and definitive, and the room absorbed his words with the particular stillness of people who have learned not to waste energy on anything the king has already decided. He never looked at her directly during the proceedings. She told herself that was to be expected. She told herself it meant nothing. If you are finding yourself wondering, as Seren was, why any of this matters, stay close. The hall will matter again before this story ends. The days that followed were structured and exhausting in the way of unfamiliar work. Seren was assigned to the upper household staff, which meant linens, hearth tending, and the carrying of water and wood to the occupied chambers along the east corridor. The east corridor was the level directly below the king's private chambers, a fact that she noted and immediately filed away as irrelevant to her situation. She shared a sleeping room with 3 other women of similar rank, 2 of them wolves from other absorbed border settlements who had arrived before her. One, a human girl named Petra, who had served the court since childhood, and who had the distinction, among the keep's lower staff, of never having been cowed into silence by a superior. Petra was small, dark-haired, and possessed of a cheerful competence that had nothing to do with naivety. She knew which senior staff members were worth avoiding, which corridors were cold at which hours, and which cuts of meat the kitchen kept separate for the upper table on feast days. She told Seren all of this in the first 3 days, with the brisk goodwill of someone who understood that information was the only currency the lower staff reliably held. "You'll want to be clear of the lower tunnels when the council meetings run long," Petra said on the second morning, passing Seren a stack of folded sheets at the linen cupboard. The senior staff use them to cut time between the council wing and the east gate, and they're not above leaving a junior wolf in the dark if she's in their way. Seren added this to her map of the keep. "Have you been assigned there?" "Not since last winter. Someone put in an order that the lower tunnels stay off the junior roster." Petra tilted her head at the particular angle of someone reconstructing a piece of information. "I always thought it odd. No reason given. Just a standing order from the king's office that the lower-ranked staff rotate above ground." Seren thought nothing particular of this at the time. She had enough to manage without wondering about the administrative logic of a man who controlled 37 subordinate packs and had likely never noticed her standing in his hall. She learned, over the next several weeks, the texture of the keep's social order. It had the quality of all hierarchies she had observed. It was precise about rank and imprecise about fairness, and the people who benefited from it were the ones most invested in calling it natural. Elder Croft occupied the top of the council's internal order, the way a stone occupies the top of a slope, not by climbing but by the simple weight of having been there longest. He moved through the keep with the unhurried authority of a man who believed his word and the court's law were essentially the same thing. He passed Seren in the West Gallery 3 weeks after her arrival, accompanied by 2 council members whose names she had not yet learned. She was carrying a tray of candle stubs to the disposal room. He looked at her as he passed and spoke to his companions without breaking stride. "The Thornford Tribute, still unassigned to anything useful. The border wolves generally take longer to find their utility." The 2 council members made sounds of agreement, and the 3 of them turned the corner and were gone. Seren stood with her tray and her candle stubs and her level chin, and did not allow the heat rising in her chest to reach her face. She had survived worse than a contemptuous old man. She would survive this. The kitchen corridor incident happened on a Tuesday morning in the 5th week, when the upper kitchen ran short on firewood, and Petra was sent down 3 flights of stairs to the secondary stores with a handcart and instructions to return in time for the midday preparation. The handcart's left wheel had a broken spoke. It was not Petra's handcart. It had been assigned to her for the trip by the senior kitchen steward, a man named Oris, who was known for distributing blame as efficiently as he distributed supplies. When the cart's wheel gave way on the lowest landing and scattered a half-cord of split wood across the stairwell floor, Petra was standing at the bottom of the pile when Oris appeared at the top of the landing. Seren was coming up from below with a bundle of kindling when she heard the steward's voice, clipped and authoritative, informing Petra that the wood was her responsibility, the delay was her fault, and the correction that was coming to her would come in front of the kitchen staff as a reminder to everyone else. Seren set down her kindling. The cart's wheel was broken before she took it, she said, from the lower landing. I passed it in the equipment room 2 days ago. The spoke was already split. Oris looked down at her with the expression of a man surprised to find himself spoken to. I was not addressing you, he said. I know, Seren said. I'm addressing you. The wheel broke on its own. Petra carried the weight of it down 3 flights on a faulty cart. If there's a correction owed, it's owed to the person who assigned the broken equipment. The pause that followed was the kind that accumulates before something either escalates or deflates. Oris held the pause long enough to make it clear he considered the decision his. He looked at Seren with the specific displeasure of a man who understands he has been outmaneuvered by someone who technically has no standing to maneuver. He turned and walked back into the kitchen. Petra let out a breath that she had apparently been holding since the cart fell. You should not have done that, she said, in the tone of someone who was also deeply grateful. He would have punished you for his own negligence, Seren said. That was not going to happen while I was standing here. What Seren did not know, and would not know for some weeks, was that the corridor opened at its far end onto a service passage that ran along the outer wall of the east wing. She did not know that the east wing's interior wall, where it abutted that service passage, was thin enough that sound traveled through it with unusual fidelity. She did not know that the man who had been standing on the other side of that wall, reading a field report at a table near the window, had heard every word of the exchange on the stairwell. She would understand later why Oris was reassigned to the outer stores by the end of that week, and why no explanation was offered. The harvest feast was held in the Great Hall on the first full moon of the cold season, which the Ironhold calendar marked as the beginning of the court's formal winter. Every ranking member of the court attended. The household staff not required for serving were allowed to stand at the gallery's lower tier, provided they held their rank position and did not speak to ranking wolves without invitation. Seren stood at the rail beside Petra and watched the hall fill with the court's upper order in a way she had not seen before, the full assembled weight of Ironhold hierarchy in formal dress, firelit and arranged by precedence. The long tables ran the hall's length, and at their head, the dais held a single extended seat for the king and, by immediate adjacency, a positioned chair for the council's senior representative. Elder Croft occupied that chair before Lachlan was seated. He looked comfortable there, as men do in seats. They have held long enough to feel like rights. Mira arrived with a retinue of 3, which was one more than any other ranking guest had brought. She was the daughter of the Caldhurst Pack's senior lord, which placed her at the highest rung of the court's non-ruling nobility, and she moved through the feast assembly with the confidence of a woman who understood that her presence was itself a political statement. She was pale-haired and deliberate in her movements, and she had, Seren observed, an acute awareness of exactly which wolves in the room were watching her. She sat 2 positions down from Lachlan's seat, close enough for casual address, and she spoke to him during the first course in a low, unhurried tone that carried the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. Midway through the second course, Mira looked up toward the lower gallery. It was not a searching look. It was the look of someone who had already noticed something and was now choosing to address it. The Thornford girl, she said, clearly enough that the ranking wolves nearest to her heard it. Still placed at the hall? I would have thought the court had better use of its formal spaces. The table's nearest occupants shifted in the subtle way of people registering a social adjustment they are not responsible for preventing. No one contradicted her. Seren kept her hands on the rail and her chin at its customary level, and she looked at the middle distance above Mira's head and breathed, and she thought of her hands, which were perfectly still, and she thought that if she could keep her hands still and her chin level, she could outlast anything that was done to her in a room full of witnesses. It was more difficult than it had ever been. She had not expected the difficulty. She had stood in harder rooms with less composure. What made this one harder was something she could not name precisely, something to do with the specific quality of the silence after Mira spoke, which had a shape to it that felt like permission. Like the court had inhaled and found the comment acceptable. She stayed at the rail until the feast's formal portion ended, because leaving early would have been read as retreat, and she would not retreat from a room where she had as much right to stand as anyone who had told her she did not. Later, if you had asked Petra what Seren's face looked like during those minutes, Petra would have said, composed, as if she had already decided to survive it, which she had. The night of the crying came 3 weeks after the feast. Seren had learned the particular acoustics of the east corridor at night, the way the stone held warmth longer than expected from the hearths below, and released it slowly so that the corridor ran a degree warmer than the chambers at the hall's far ends. She had learned which step on the back stair creaked, and which floorboard in the linen room lay at an angle that would catch a tired foot in the dark. She had learned not to cry until she was certain the corridor was empty. She had held everything that had accumulated since the feast in a place inside her chest that she had developed over years of practice for exactly this purpose, and she had held it through the 11 days since the feast with the patience of someone who knows the container will hold if she does not test it. The night she tested it, she was sitting on the floor of the linen room with her back against the shelving and her knees drawn up, and the sound she made was not loud. She was practiced at that too. What she had not known, and what no one had told her, was that the linen room's outer wall was the inner wall of the narrow service passage running alongside the east wing, and that the east wing's upper chambers shared that same passage's other face. She had not known that sound traveled through those walls. She cried because she was tired, and because she was 19, and because she had not, in the 3 months since Thornford dissolved, been permitted the simple dignity of being angry at the right targets. The court had named her a tribute before she could name herself anything else. Elder Croft had used her like a demonstration. Mira had looked at her in that hall and spoken as if she were furniture that had been placed wrong. And Seren had kept her chin level and her hands still, and had not given any of them the satisfaction of seeing her diminished, and the keeping of it was its own kind of exhaustion. She cried for perhaps 20 minutes. Then she gathered herself off the floor, folded the extra linen that did not need folding, and went back to her room and lay on her pallet and looked at the ceiling and waited for sleep. In the chamber on the other side of the wall, Lachlan Ironhold sat at his table with the field report still open in front of him and did not read another word of it. He sat there as the night grew past its midpoint and the torches in the corridor burned down. He heard her stop, and the silence after was somehow heavier than the sound had been. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and something in him that he generally kept very controlled pulled at the cage of his chest like a wolf at the fence of its run. He did not sleep until the light in the east window had gone from black to gray. It was Devon who noticed first, because Devon's function in the king's world was to notice. He had been the king's second for 7 years, and in those 7 years, he had developed the particular talent of tracking the king's attention, the way a sailor tracks a shift in wind. By reading the secondary signals before the primary ones became visible, he noticed that the king asked, twice in 10 days, oblique questions about the household staff assignments on the east wing. He noticed that the order about the lower tunnels, issued 6 weeks prior, had been quietly confirmed in the standing record rather than expiring as temporary orders did. He noticed that when Mira made her remark at the feast table and the king's face did not change, the king's right hand had closed very briefly and very deliberately on the arm of his chair before it opened again. Devon did not speak any of this to the king. He had not been asked, and he understood, as good seconds understood, that some knowledge is more useful held than shared. What he did do, on the day after the feast, was walk to the court's archive room, which was 3 levels below the council hall in the oldest part of the keep, and he pulled the original tribute documentation from the Thornford Settlement's file. He read it carefully. He read it again. Then he carried it back to his own chamber and placed it flat under the board beneath his hearthstone, and he went about the rest of his day with the specific neutral expression of a man who has found something he intends to use at the right moment. The original terms of the Thornford tribute, as recorded at the time of the settlement's dissolution, specified a service bond of 1 season's duration, not 3. The conversion from grain tithe to service bond was documented as a direct ratio, 1 season of tithe, 1 season of service. The ratio was clear, signed and sealed by both the council's administrative officer at the time and the Thornford Pact's last senior witness. Elder Croft's recitation at the tribute hall had named 3 seasons. The document named 1. Someone had altered the terms. Seren learned none of this when it would have been useful. She went about her work in the east corridor and the kitchen passage and the linen room, and she developed the small practiced stoicism of a person who has decided that endurance is not the same as defeat. Petra brought her extra bread on cold mornings and told her the kitchen gossip and was, in those weeks, the thing that made the keep feel less entirely hostile. Elder Croft stopped her in the East Gallery on a morning in the 7th week, accompanied this time by only 1 council member but with the sealed scroll returned to his hands. "The tribute assessment is under review," he said, with the air of someone conveying routine administrative information. "The council is considering the appropriate classification for unranked service wolves. You may be notified of a change in your bond's terms." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of change?" "A labor bond," he said. "More specific than the current arrangement, more permanent." He paused, in the way of a man who enjoys pauses. "It would, of course, supersede any prior claims on your status. Under Ironhold law, a sealed labor bond defines the wolf's standing definitively. No other party could assert a competing claim afterward." She understood what he was saying. A labor bond, once sealed, would make her a ward of the council in perpetuity. Not the King's Court, the council's, under Croft's authority, effectively. And no mate claim, no bond of any other kind, would have any legal footing to challenge it afterward. She did not ask him why. She already knew why. The why was written in the way his eyes moved over her when she said nothing, and the way his posture settled, satisfied. She was getting closer to something. He could see it, even if she could not yet name it. And he meant to close the door before she arrived. The council meeting that preceded the labor bond rite was brief and closed. Devon was not invited to attend, which was itself unusual enough that he noted it. 3 days after that meeting, the summons was issued to Seren by a junior council clerk who slid the notice under the kitchen corridor door before dawn. She was to appear at the council hall at midday. The labor bond rite would be conducted in full session. She held the notice in both hands in the kitchen corridor light and read it twice. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went to find Petra, who was already at work in the kitchen. "Do not come to the hall today," Seren told her, setting a pot on the hook above the fire with the deliberate movements of someone managing something internal. "Stay in the kitchen. Whatever you hear, stay here." Petra looked at her. "What's happening?" "I don't know yet," Seren said, which was nearly true. The walk to the council hall at midday took her through the west corridor, past the gallery where Croft had first named her in front of his companions, past the door to the archive room 3 levels down, and up the wide stone stair that led to the hall's formal entrance. The hall was smaller than the tribute hall, but built with the same vaulted deliberateness, and the council sat in a horseshoe arrangement of carved seats, 12 members in their formal robes, with Elder Croft at the head. She walked to the center of the floor. The rite, as Croft explained it to the assembled council, was a formal classification procedure. The scroll he held was a different one than she had seen before, longer, its wax seal already broken and the signature line waiting. He recited the terms as though they were simply legal procedure, as though the 3-season bond were an established and uncontested fact, as though the labor bond were a natural consequence of her unranked status rather than a lock being fitted to a specific door. He spoke her name, her former pack, and her current status, and he used the phrase she had heard twice before, once in the tribute hall and once in the gallery, with the specific variation of a man who has refined his dismissal over repetition. Unranked, he said, unbonded, ward of the council pending this classification. The third time it landed differently than the first two. She was standing in a formal hall with no witness on her side, in a proceeding that had been arranged to complete before any inconvenient documentation could surface, and she understood with the calm clarity of someone who has already processed the worst of it that the door he was trying to close was very nearly shut. She raised her chin to exactly the angle she had maintained in the tribute hall on the morning she arrived, and she waited. The doors opened behind her. Not one door. Both doors together, the full formal width of the council hall's entrance, thrown back in the way they were opened for the king's formal arrivals, because the man filling the frame was Lachlan Ironhold, with Devon at his shoulder. The hall went very quiet. Lachlan walked to the center of the floor and stopped beside her, and the air in the room reorganized itself around where he was, in the way it always did. And the council members who had been sitting in the comfortable authority of a closed session suddenly found themselves in a room where the hierarchy had just changed. "The rite is stopped," Lachlan said. Not asked, not suggested. Elder Croft held the scroll. His face had gone through several arrangements before settling on the one it could best maintain, controlled affront. "The rite is a lawful council proceeding, my lord," he said. "The bond terms are established and the session is properly convened." "The bond terms," Lachlan said, "are falsified." Devon stepped forward, and he was carrying a document held flat in both hands. He placed it on the council's central table, and several members leaned to look at it in the way of people who already suspect what they are about to read. "The original Thornford tribute filing," Devon said. His voice was level and without drama. "Sealed at dissolution. 1 season of service, not 3. The silence in the hall was specific and weighted. It had the quality of something that could not be called back, of a stone falling in water and the water already moving. Elder Croft looked at the document and then looked at the wall above the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make what was already clear more clearly true. Lachlan turned to look at Seren for the first time since the proceedings in the tribute hall, the first full direct look in 7 weeks of shared walls and corridor silences. And there was nothing controlled about it. Something had come to the surface of his face that she had not seen before. It was not soft exactly. It was something she had no word for, a recognition that had the weight of a decision already made. "1 season," he said. He was speaking to the hall. "Served and complete. She has met the terms." She did not know, standing there, that he had issued the order about the lower tunnels 6 weeks ago, because the thought of her navigating those passages in the dark had settled over him like something wrong. She did not know that he had reassigned Oris to the outer stores, within 2 days of overhearing a girl with a tray of kindling refuse to let a steward punish someone for his own negligence. She did not know that he had sat at a table with his hands flat on the surface and not slept until dawn, because the sound she had made through a stone wall had reached some part of him that his authority had never learned to manage. She knew now, looking at his face, that he had come, that he had come here, to this hall, before the full council, when he could have resolved it quietly through administrative channels and kept his own part of it hidden. That he had chosen to be standing in this room rather than behind a closed door. That the hall was full of witnesses, and he had opened both doors. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was careful and complete, and she felt it the way she had felt the wall between the linen room and his chamber, as something that had already been there, and the knowing of it was not a surprise so much as a recognition of what she had already been holding. "She stands as my own," he said, to the hall, to the council, to the 12 seated members and the one disgraced one, to the walls and the vaulted ceiling and the record that Devon would file before nightfall. Uncontested. Elder Croft was removed from the council seat before the session formally closed. Devon had prepared the secondary documentation with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, and the grounds were unambiguous. Falsification of tribute terms, improper classification of award. The council members who had attended the session voted without extended deliberation, because the document was on the table and the king was standing in the room, and some things resolve themselves when the right light falls on them. Mira's retinue departed Ironhold Court within the week. There was no formal announcement. Her father's political claim had rested on the assumption that Lachlan's standing was still open. It was not open. The record was clear. Petra heard about it in the kitchen before the evening meal, from 2 different sources, and she put down the pot she was holding and sat on a bench and pressed both hands over her mouth, and made a sound that was not exactly crying, and not exactly not. The winter came fully over Ironhold in the weeks that followed, the kind of winter the court's stone corridors were built for, deep and still and lit at intervals, by hearths that held their heat long. Seren moved through the keep differently now, not because she performed it, but because the world had rearranged itself around what the king had said in front of witnesses, and the wolves in the corridor made room in the way wolves made room when the rearrangement was real and permanent. She learned over the weeks the things she had not known: the tunnel order, Oris and the outer stores. The night Devon had gone to the archive room the day after the feast and found what he found and held it, waiting, because good seconds understood timing. She learned these things not from Lachlan directly, but in the way of a court that talks, through Petra, through a word from Devon offered one morning in the corridor with the precise brevity of a man who considered it important that she know. She thought about the linen room and the stone wall and the 20 minutes in the dark, and she thought about a man sitting at a table with his hands flat and the field report unread, and she thought it was possible that the wall between them had been thin for longer than either of them had known. On the morning of the court's midwinter gathering, the full assembly was called to the tribute hall. The same hall, the same stone floor, and the same vaulted ceiling, and the same gallery where the ranked wolves stood in their ordered positions. The same torches in the same brackets, casting the same warm variable light. Seren stood in the center of the floor. She had stood there before. The first time, she had stood there as a tribute, as a debt, as Elder Croft's demonstration, as an item on a list. This time, Lachlan came to stand beside her, and the hall arranged itself around where they both were. The formal declaration was brief in the way of things that have been decided and require only witness. Devon read the record, the falsified terms, the correction, the original sealed document, now placed in the official archive with notation. 1 season of tribute completed. Status: free wolf. Standing: claimed, uncontested, the king's own. He did not say unranked. No one in the hall said unranked. The gallery stood witness, and the wolves at the upper tier bowed their heads in the formal acknowledgement, and Seren watched them do it with her chin at the angle it had always been, the one she had developed for harder rooms and direr moments, and found that holding it now cost her nothing at all. The gathering released at midday, and the keep's corridors filled with the usual motion of a court resuming its ordinary business. Serene moved through them with Petra at her side, and Petra talked without stopping for the length of 2 full corridors about absolutely everything except the thing they were both thinking about, which was that the hall they had just stood in was the same hall, and it was entirely different. "I put extra wood in the east corridor hearths this morning," Petra said at the turn of the stair. "Before I knew you would be there, I just thought it was cold." Seren looked at her. "Did you?" "The east wing always runs warmer," Petra said, with the cheerful accuracy of a woman who has no patience for unnecessary mystery. "Someone arranged it that way." Seren went back through the east corridor late that afternoon, when the winter light had gone amber and low, and the keep's stone walls held the accumulated warmth of a full day's hearth fires. She walked its length to the door of the linen room, and she put her hand on it, not to open it, just for a moment, and she thought of the floor and the shelving and the dark outside the single lamp, and the wall, and what had lived on the other side of it without either of them naming it yet. The door to Lachlan's chamber was at the corridor's far end. He was standing in the open frame of it, not dramatically, simply present, watching her from the length of the corridor with the still attention she had learned to read correctly, which was to say, as attention. She let her hand fall from the linen room door and walked toward him. She had been in harder rooms. She had kept her hand still in harder rooms than this, and her chin level, and her composure whole, and she had done it because there was no one else to do it for her, and the alternative was not something she had ever allowed herself. She walked the length of the corridor, and the stone was warm under her feet, and the hearths on either side of the passage had been tended that morning before she knew why, and when she reached the doorway, she stopped. He held out his hand. Not a command. An open hand, palm up, waiting for a weight it had already decided it would carry. She placed her hand in his. He had not slept until dawn. Once. For the sound of her through a wall. She had not known. And he had not said so. And the hall had not known either. And none of it had prevented what the morning had made irrevocable in front of every witness the court could hold. Outside, the winter settled over Ironhold as it always did, patient and deep and indifferent to the politics of the rooms it pressed against. The stone kept its warmth. The corridors held their quiet. Somewhere in the archive, Devon's sealed notation sat in its proper place in the official record, exactly where it needed to be, and would not be moved again. The east corridor at evening was warm, and Seren was not standing in it alone.